and welcome to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and this evening I will be doing a review of Embassytown by China Miéville. Now before I get into my review, a little heads up, I'm gonna do things a little differently this time and going forward. I really want to avoid spoiling main plot elements and main world building elements for this novel. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do my review, talk about the themes, etc. like usual, but really stay in the abstract somewhat. And then at the end, I will have a section where I go into some of the spoilers because I really want to talk about this book in detail. And then I'll do my reading of the quotes after that. And I'll, of course, give a spoiler warning for both these sections at the relevant time. So first off, let me tell you that I actually loved this novel. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. What is it about though? It's difficult to synopsize, I think, but basically you have this planet called Ariaka on which live a colony of humans in a city called Embassytown. The aliens are called hosts or Ariaki, and they cannot lie. Their language is very strange. It's literal expression of things as they exist in the world, and so their brains cannot process deception, metaphors, abstract thinking, because they really need words to be real things. And the story is told from the point of view of a main female character called Avice. And Avice is what is called an immerser. It's a kind of extra-temporal, extra-spatial explorer and voyager. I'll get back to that. And well, basically, the story really starts when a couple of new ambassadors arrive at Embassytown. Ambassadors are specialized humans used to communicate with the hosts, because the hosts, beyond their weird language that does not allow lies or deceptions and abstract thinking, it also relies on a couple of other weird details that I'll get back to. So they need these special humans called ambassadors. They work in pairs, and a new pair of ambassadors coming from the metropolis, which is Bremen, on a planet called Dagostin, I think, arrive, and they start talking, and things go very, very wrong. And the story goes on from there, and it devolves into a mix of things. Let's leave it at that for now. I was once again taken by the writing of China Miéville. I still maintain he is a wonderful wordsmith and story crafter. I didn't find as many neologisms or outright, SFF pop culture references than I did in Kraken, but that makes sense. It's a very different kind of story. It's a self-contained story with its own very unique world building. I mean, there are neologisms, but I don't know, I thought there were just a wee bit less of them. Once again, I found there was a really good, even almost perfect balance between a very high level of vocabulary and common parlance, even rougher slang. Once again, I had to look up a few words. I even installed the dictionary app on my phone to make all that easier. So yeah, this might bother some people. I didn't mind learning new words. I think it's always interesting. But yeah, there are these contrasts in vocabulary and vernacular, but it all meshes together seamlessly. It just works. Now, whilst Kraken was within the realm of urban fantasy and something like City and the City is within the realm of, I guess also a bit urban fantasy or science fiction with a splash of, thriller. Well, this is squarely within the realm of science fiction with, of course, a dash of just pure weirdness, which Miéville is known for. And, well, the way the story is structured, it starts off for the first quarter of it with a dual timeline. Basically, the story is told from the present and also from the past leading up to the present to serve as, a kind of exposition tool to explain elements of world building and the main character Avice's past, because this informs her experience in the present. But then after that, the story is straightforward in the present. What kind of story is this? Like I said, it's a mix of things, honestly. At the most basic, you could argue it's kind of a story of a civil war, maybe. But there's political intrigue. It's also a story about communication with an alien species, about communication among humans too, actually. It's a lot of things at the same time, which I think is one of Miéville's strengths, honestly. And character-wise, I will say this, I do think the characterization is deeper than it was in Kraken, and the author does spend more time on fleshing out character relationships and looking at the characters' inner emotional lives. I really enjoyed that. Now, the main character, like I said, is a woman named Avice Bennett. She is an immerser. An immerser, like I said, is kind of extra spatial and extra temporal. I'll get back to that. Explorer, voyager, so she was part of like a ship crew, and she traveled extensively around the universe, went to several different planets, but she's a native of Embassytown and goes back to Embassytown with her husband, Sile, because Sile is a linguist very much interested in the extremely strange and unique language of the hosts, or Ariaki, which are the indigenous alien species, the indigenous sentient alien species of Ariaka. Avice, I would say, is a very plucky woman, very resourceful. She's an expert at something she calls floaking. Now, it's kind of hard to explain what floaking is, but it's like knowing how to ride the currents of fate and just making the best of every situation. So yeah, she's great at that. She gets enmeshed with the local politics of Embassytown, has relationships with some of the ambassadors, some of the staff with a capital S. They're like the local government, basically. But she also has a best friend who is a robot. I thought she was an interesting character. She's very direct, straightforward, and sometimes you might think she's a bit cold or too distant from what's happening, but she feels things very deeply. It's just she has a hard time putting it into words, which is interesting because she's basically the one telling the story. It's told in first-person point of view. It's her first-person account of what's happening in Embassytown. I think you can actually guess that she's telling this from the future. She's looking back onto this major event that takes place in the novel. And so there's a cast of surrounding characters. You have Sile, her husband, who's just a very passionate linguist, who becomes even, I would say, obsessed with the language of the hosts. And then you have some characters from within Embassytown itself. You have a few of these ambassadors I mentioned. You have Cal Vin, and there's a reason why I'm pronouncing it that way. I'll get back to that. It's hard to really characterize them. They have an intimate relationship with Avice, and something happens to them, and one of them becomes very opportunistic and very resentful because of events. You have Avice's best friend, who is a robot, who has amazing AI and acts like, a conspiratorial best friend with whom she can share secrets, and she has a lot of intel on various different things, but then she kind of drops Avice, and Avice kind of realizes that she was doing this with several other human beings, so she feels very hurt by that robot. And then you have Bren, and Bren is also a former ambassador who Avice gets into an intimate relationship with. There's lots of consensual non-monogamy going on in there. I was there for that. And Bren is, very pragmatic, very almost cynical, I would say, but also wise in a way. He is older than Avice. There's wisdom to him, a sad wisdom. It's hard to really explain. And he's part of like an underground society living within the host city within which is embedded Embassytown. So Embassytown is a colony situated within one of these big host cities. And they've got like a massive oxygen bubble above it because the native atmosphere is not breathable by humans anyway. And then of course you have these Ariaki. And there are several individual Ariaki which have a more prominent role in the story. One is called Spanish Dancer. Avice gives these human names to them, but they have very strange names because of their very strange language. So there is a bit of individuality going on there, and that was really interesting to read about. But yeah, I'm not going to go too deeply into the characters, but that gives you a very general picture. I felt connected to the characters. I felt connected to Avice, though we have fairly different personalities, but I was really moved by what she was experiencing and what she said about her relationships. A few of the quotes I wrote down had to do with some of her reflections on love, intimacy, etc. And now we get to the world building, and there's lots to say about that. Overall, it's excellent world building. There are only a couple of little narrative holes I would have liked to see filled. But yeah, I was extremely satisfied. I'm going to touch upon a few elements of world building that I think really stood out. And also note that this packs a lot of stuff in, a lot of information, and some of it actually is presented in a very casual, matter-of-fact way. Like I said, consensual non-monogamy is just there. It's not really talked about, it's not a big deal, but Avice has been married 4 times. Sile is her current husband, but they don't have a sexual relationship. That's also pretty cool for like alternative relationship types for people who are asexual, for example. They're married and they love each other and they're connected, but they don't have a sexual relationship. But on the other hand, Avice has intimate relationships with other people, and she's had them with men and women, so she's also bisexual, but it's not touched upon in any detailed way, it's just there, so that was cool. Or one of the more prominent elements of world building is introduced early on, but then isn't really the focal point of the story, but it's still there, and it's referenced a few times because, well, Avice is an immerser, so that talks about the Immer. So what is the Immer, you might ask? Well, the Immer is the dimension that harbors the physical universe. So, insofar as you admit that there's something outside of the known universe, that is the Immer. And humans have figured out a way of exiting the physical universe and riding the currents of the Immer to travel from one place of the universe to the other. It's sort of hinted at that this gives you an advantage with regards to distances and time spent traveling. Otherwise, why would they bother doing it, right? So I guess you can exit the universe at a certain point and exit at another point. It would only take you like a couple of weeks, whereas if you traveled using regular spaceships, it would have taken like 40 years. I'm assuming that's how it works. But it's strange because they describe creatures in the Immer, but not living creatures as we understand them, but like aggregations of Immer stuff that attacks the ships. And also you need to have a very specific kind of psychology to travel in the Immer while conscious. Most people get put to sleep to travel in the Immer because it just scrambles with your senses. I guess it makes sense since it's outside of the physical universe. Your brain wouldn't even be able to process that, right? It would shut down or explode, I don't know. But some human beings have adult perception of things, I guess, because they test them and she passes all the tests, and so she's deemed a great candidate to become an immerser, and that's her job. And so she travels a lot around the universe, doing that, carrying freight or passengers, etc. So that was a really neat concept, but it's not that central to the story. Now, one thing I didn't really understand is he calls, in this novel, descendants of, well, regular humans, he calls them Terries. T-E-R-R-E. Normally you'd want to say Terran or terrestrial, but Terry, it felt very uncomfortable in my mind. Anyway, so you have all these descendants from Homo sapiens on planet Earth, but I think that's what I understood. Planet Earth has actually been lost. No one really knows where it is anymore because it's been so long since humans expanded into space. And the main political power is a planet called Dagostin, the capital of which is Bremen, which has all these colonies, including Embassytown. And so there's a distinction made between Terries, descendants of, well, Earth Homo sapiens, and Exots, which are all the other alien species. And there are a few mentioned. I mean, you've got the hosts, which are the more interesting ones, but you've got like 3 others mentioned in the story, so that's pretty cool. But the main subject, of course, are the Ariaki and the ambassadors of, well, Embassytown. Ambassadors are pairs of human beings, but not just any pair, they're basically clones of one another, because they have to speak at the same time, have to be so empathetic. I mean, this is enhanced with like implants in the brain, genetic modifications, etc. They have to speak with one voice, but from 2 different bodies. So I think it's an interesting idea because they're still distinct people, they're really at this limit between 2 individuals that are extremely close and actually one person in 2 bodies. And so Avice has a relationship with one of these ambassadors called Cal Vin, and it's pronounced that way because it's Cal with a capital C and Vin with a capital V. Cal is one person and Vin is the other. And so when she has a relationship with Calvin, she has a relationship with both of them and they have sex. They have sex together. I thought that was so incredibly weird. And so the reason they use this system is because, the hosts, the Ariaki, are again some of the most original aliens I've ever encountered in fiction. They look very weird. But in any case, they have 2 vocal organs, and their language consists of 2 words said at the same time. And what's more, they can only perceive meaning from sentient creatures. So they can't actually understand a voice generated by a machine. I think they can understand recordings of sentient beings, but not a machine. They have to hear something produced by a thinking creature. And the thinking creature has to speak with this dual voice that represents a single intention, hence the usage of these ambassadors. It's very, very original and very heady stuff. And so, like I said, they cannot lie because their language, and language is not even called a language, it's called language with a capital L. Language, they explain, is like the auditory manifestation of what exists, of what is real, which is very interesting. And as to the theme, I'm going to get back to that because there are lots of implications with that. Now, as to the themes, I think there are several themes floating around in there. The first one is, again, a bit obvious. It's the theme of the relationship between, well, language and thought. Linguistic relativity, anyone? Again. But this is the best version of that I've come across yet. Honestly, because I think Miéville's stroke of genius was to have an alien species have their thoughts constrained by their language. Because that's the problem I had with other books. I didn't really buy it for human beings because we have proof, living as human beings, that it doesn't really apply to us perfectly. Like, we can still think things that don't have words for them. So he shifted the issue onto an other species. These Ariaki literally cannot think of things that don't exist because there are no words for things that don't exist, and they cannot think things for which there are no words. Or do they? I'll get back to that. That was brilliant, really. And it's a very interesting idea because, without getting into spoilers, you see a development with the Ariaki and you realize that, well, perhaps they do have a capacity for thought because communication in itself, from which language derives, goes beyond words. Even in humans, you have lots of bodily communications, and that kind of is a key to the Ariaki's evolution. There's also this idea of individuality versus or with community. I think it might be a bit subdued, but there's a conversation going on about the role of the individual and the individual's freedom versus his or hers or its community, its group, what kind of relationship the individual has with the group, the love one can have for one's people, etc. Also, this wasn't apparent to me at first, but reading towards like the middle, a few of the quotes, I was like, yeah, I know where you're going with this. This is also kind of about colonialism and or post-colonialism. I mean, there's definitely a discussion going on there about, Embassytown's autonomy, its dependence on Bremen, the metropolis. How is that affecting their relationship with the Ariaki? Because, they can't lie, so aren't they being taken advantage of a little bit? Because the Ariaki do provide the humans with super cool alien technology. I forgot to mention that in the world building section. Yeah, they have this very strange organic tech. So they'll grow machines, even weapons, oxygen units from pseudo-animals and pseudo-plants. So you'll have farms where they have these fleshy creatures and they harvest medicine from them or objects from them. That really to me was the weird element with all the fleshy stuff and the gooey stuff. That to me just screamed weird fiction. And so, they're taken advantage of a little bit because they can't lie. They have to take the humans at face value and they have to trust them. And the humans then, give this tech to the metropolis. But they're also very independent because it's explained that Embassytown is on the edges of the known universe. It's very difficult to access. So Bremen has a loose hold on them. That's why they send their own ambassador there, which causes everything to go haywire. And so you have these politics going on. You have factions that want to break away from Bremen, and you have a Bremen representative that wants to strengthen the hold of the metropolis on the colony. There's several layers of colonialism going on. You have the colonialism of Bremen with Embassytown, even though technically Embassytown ultimately comes from Bremen, and then, the humans colonizing this bit of Ariaka and, maybe not exploiting outright, but, like I said, taking advantage of all this super cool tech the Ariaki are giving them. Ultimately, I don't even really know what the Ariaki are getting out of their relationship with humans, though what they are getting out of, I do know, it's the possibility to, well, envisage evolutions in their language, because they have a thing called the Festival of Lies, in which humans participate, ambassadors, and the Aryaki try to lie. And they also use humans to create similes, to help them think in new ways, and this is very important to the progression of the story. And a final theme which directly connects to what I said about colonialism, what I said about identity, community, and also the relationship between thought and language, or if you want to call it linguistic relativity, it's the theme of freedom, really. Freedom of determination, of self-determination as a nation state. The freedom to be yourself, to be an individual within your community and not have to necessarily depend on a hive mind, but also recognizing that you cannot exist outside of your community if you communicate with them. This is especially illustrated by the Aryaki, I think. And also freedom of thought. That's the most interesting one, I think, because, like I said, there's a progression in the Aryaki's relationship to language and abstract thought. And this, in a way, liberates them. There's this whole metaphor running through the novel about angels and the fall, because one of the characters compares the Aryaki to angels because they cannot lie. And he says their language is the language of God. They don't really believe in God, but that's what he says. And if they learn to lie, they will fall to the level of lowly humans, and they will be corrupted by deception and sin, etc. Put in biblical terms, it's eating from the tree of knowledge, isn't it? It's the freedom to think. It's the freedom to decide the path your life will take, or the path your civilization will take, in the case of the Aryaki, and, taking the next step in the evolution of your species. Okay, so now I'm going to get into real, actual spoilers. And after that, I'll read some quotes, but some of the quotes are very spoilery as well, so you've been officially warned. Okay, so what really blew my mind, when I read this book, the concept of getting high on language, that is just insane and pure genius. When I read that, I was like, no, you did not. What? Insane. But so original, and it makes perfect sense if you think about the Aryaki. It just opens their minds, and nothing else could happen in the story if you don't have that first moment of them getting drugged on the speech of Ezra, the ambassador sent by Bremen. They're not clones of one another, or doubles, as they're called in the book. So there's a bit of, I guess, dissonance between their voices, and so the Aryaki can't process that lag between the two voices, which I guess suggests differing intent, which messes with their minds, and so they become oraties, drugged on oration. That's just, wow, respect, man, honestly. And another thing I found, interesting, I don't think it was intentional, I don't know, but you know how in fantasy there's this concept / trope of the original language, in which you can do magic, and oftentimes it's the true names of things. It's literally the vocal equivalent of a thing's essence. You have that in the inheritance cycle, you have that, of course, in the Earthsea cycle as well. And here I think he kind of flipped it on its head, because in this case, this language the Aryaki have, which is, again, a literal auditory manifestation of things, of their essence, this is actually shackling them to a very primitive way of thinking. I thought that was brilliant as well. I'd never seen that idea reversed like that. In this case, it's not a good thing. It's actually very limiting and very constraining on their thought processes. And also, when there's this confrontation between the absurd and the oraties who are trying to work with a vice to learn to lie and to reach the level of metaphor and abstract thought, I thought it was really interesting that the absurd actually stumble upon regular thought-freeing language by using bodily communication, because that brings it right back around to humans who often forget that they communicate way more than they simply do with spoken words. We communicate with our bodies, with our facial expressions, perhaps even on a chemical level with pheromones, though that is a lot more debatable. And this is actually what frees the absurd, the deaf Aryaki, which gives them access then to written language. And ultimately this dynamic discussion between thought and language. My thought was that the idea, I guess, of linguistic relativity, or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, is that thought is restrained by language. And this is exactly the case with the Ariake. They cannot think things for which they have no words. And they can't even have words for things that aren't immediately, I guess, in front of their eyes, or that they can feel with their hearts or experience with their senses. But in fact, when they evolve and reach a state of language without the capital L, they finally can use language as a tool of their thoughts. And it gets back to the place where humans are. Language is a tool for our thoughts, with which we can do whatever we want, basically. We're not beholden to language. Language depends on us, is what I mean. Like, thought comes first, and then language helps us express it, share it, communicate it, develop it, etc. It was brilliant. Honestly, I haven't read this great of a book in a while. I was even actually moved by the end, like touched emotionally. I wasn't expecting that. Like I said, there's a lot more character depth and emotional involvement, I felt. So yeah, the end had me like, oh, it was a good ending. I felt good. And now I'll get to the quotes I wrote down. It could be sounded out by where, it could be written, neither of which forms the hosts, for which language was speech spoken by a thinker thinking thoughts, could understand. They can't be insouciant at the first sight of any exotic race. The theory is that we're hardwired with the terry biome, that every glimpse of anything not descended from that original backwater home, our bodies know we should not ever see. It felt like being a child again, though it was not. Being a child is like nothing, it's only being. Later, when we think about it, we make it into youth. Many of the ports at which I've docked are in or by such areas. It's as if slumism is an infection carried by ships. Whenever any society dies, there must be heroes whose fight back is to not change. A few in control of their diction would rule over those not, compradors at our behest, an narcocracy of language. We'd have to be careful pushers of our product. Whatever had happened to Cal, whatever he'd become, I was sure that he saw me as I saw him through a window of memories that included mornings, evenings together, nudity, a fucking, sometimes beautifully. What could I do but remember the last looks Vin had given me? I'd seen that need that could perhaps have been given another name, and that perhaps Cal resented. Truth is, Avice, I can't tell you if I miss him. That's not true. I can tell you, and I do, but it isn't as clean a feeling as that. It made that falsity a true aspiration. Seul Tesh Escher, insisting on a certain might be, changed what was. It had learned to lie to insist on a truth. Each word of language meant just what it meant. Polysemy or ambiguity were impossible, and with them most tropes that made other languages languages at all. But thatness faces every way. It's flexible because it's empty, a universal equivalent. That always means, and not that other, too. In their lonely silent way, the absurd had made a semiotic revolution and a new language. If similes do their job well enough, they turn into something else. We tell the truth best by becoming lies. With the boisterous astonishment of revelation, they pressed the similes by which I'd named them on until they were lies, telling a truth they'd never been able to before. They spoke metaphors. If language, thought, and world were separated, as they just had been, there was no succulence, no titillating impossible, no mystery. Where language had been, there was only language, signifying sound to do things with and to. In the beginning was each word of language, sound isomorphic with some real, not a thought, not really, only self-expressed worldness, speaking itself through the Ariake. Language had always been redundant, it had only ever been the world. Now the Ariake were learning to speak and to think, and it hurt. I saw the upthrown gift wings and fan wings of ecstasy in an old sense, not without pain and terror, of visions, and then the silence of the adult Ariake, newborn. And that concludes my review of Embassytown. I'm excited to read something else by Miéville, honestly. Again, if anyone has any suggestions to point me towards what I should be reading next by him, I am all ears. And I would highly, highly recommend Embassytown, especially if you're also interested in this idea of linguistic relativity in science fiction / weird fiction. This is by far the best iteration of that general idea I've come across yet. I hope you've enjoyed the review, found it interesting. I hope you will have a lovely day or evening. Keep yourself safe, of course, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye bye!